Support for this podcast comes from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative, connecting communities with the resources, infrastructure, and networks to ensure a vibrant local free press.
From KVPR in Fresno, this is Central Valley Daily. It's Thursday, January 23rd. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Over 20 years ago, then California Governor Gray Davis signed a bill into law banning the burning of crops in the Central Valley. Now that law has finally gone fully into effect.
True lasting change does take a lot of time. And most of it was because we gave some pretty strict requirements.
In just a few minutes, we'll speak with the Valley native who helped write that bill. But first, today's headlines. Evacuation orders are in place following the development of the Hughes Fire south of the Grapevine. The fire's burning north of Castaic Lake. It's already consumed over 10,000 acres after sparking Wednesday morning. Evacuation orders and warnings extend from Santa Clarita up to Frazier Park. An organization representing farm workers has received postcards threatening people without legal status. As KVPR's Carrie Klein reports, this has happened before.
The postcards were sent to 3 offices of the United Farm Workers Union, including 2 in the Valley. They read, "Report illegal aliens," and, quote, "There is nowhere to hide." They include a phone number and website to send tips to federal immigration officials. It's the latest move intimidating farm workers, many of whom lack legal status. A string of arrests by Border Patrol in Kern County earlier this month reportedly forced many of them to avoid work for fear of deportation. It's unclear who sent the postcards. They appear to have been postmarked in Oakland. In place of a return address, the backs of the cards merely read "Trump's coming." Similar flyers have been reported in various cities at other times, including during the first Trump administration. A UFW spokesperson says the organization has received much worse threats than this one. For KVPR News, I'm Carrie Klein.
A new poll shows Americans are far from a consensus on immigration. The poll by the Associated Press and NORC at the University of Chicago shows the majority of U.S. adults favor deporting immigrants convicted of violent crimes. This is one of President Trump's main rallying cries around immigration policy. But his executive orders this week have already gone beyond that, with immediate changes to the asylum process. Americans, meanwhile, are divided over Trump's actions to keep asylum seekers in Mexico and end birthright citizenship. The Fresno Yosemite International Airport processed a record 2.6 million passengers last year. That's a 9% increase from the year before. Airport officials are celebrating this milestone. They say it's due to more flights being added and more seating capacity. The airport's also currently undergoing an expansion and adding a new terminal to accommodate more travelers.
Do you have us on your calendar for tonight? We're expecting a big crowd to join us for KVPR's Open House event, and we want you to be a part of it. The open house is from 5 to 7 p.m. at our Clovis Broadcast Center. Come hang out, enjoy some light apps, and meet the KVPR News team to see how public radio happens. RSVP online at kvpr.org/openhouse.
And now to our main story. Several new laws took effect this year in California, and among them is a big one for Valley farmers, a ban on agricultural burning. That's the practice of lighting trees, vines, and prunings on fire to clear a field or eliminate disease from an orchard. The practice was common for many crops, including almonds and grapes. But the resulting smoke has also proven to be a health hazard for nearby residents. And it doesn't help that the valley is an air basin that consistently ranks among the unhealthiest in the nation. The law that banned ag burning was actually passed more than 20 years ago by Governor Gray Davis. Since then, farmers and growers were given a chance to phase out the practice by finding alternative methods. But now the ban is here to stay, and we sat down with the author of the legislation, former State Senator Dean Flores, to talk about his work to make this a reality.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, being born and raised in the Central Valley, I have seen the progression of pollution from being a little kid, taking out tin cans large barrels and burning trash in unincorporated areas. Finally, that practice ended. There were actually services that came out and took the trash to the disposal. So it's kind of interesting to have grown up in the Central Valley, knowing that burning, period, and ag burning in particular, has been a part of the history of the Central Valley since the 1850s. So when I got into the legislature, clearly the most important issue for me was the fact that a good 37% of kids going to school carried inhalers to class, and that was one of the highest rates of asthma. And obviously, the Central Valley ended up the first or second dirtiest basin in the nation, competing with Los Angeles on any given year. So we introduced a series of bills in 2003 that targeted various aspects of agriculture's contribution to pollution in Central Valley. SB 700 was the major that eliminated their exemption to the Clean Air Act. And then there was a series of bills that tried to deal with what we thought were some of the most polluting aspects, including bringing dairies under California Air Resources Board, and of course, ag burning, which was a bill, SB 705. So we fought very hard to get these two bills and the entire package, quite frankly, through the legislature, and was successful and had Governor Davis sign it at that time.
Couple things I want to follow up there. But first of all, let's drill down a little bit into the agriculture industry that's being impacted. Mm-hmm. Any particular commodities that are burning more than others? You mentioned bringing dairies into this as well. Can you give us just a little more for folks who aren't too familiar? Why are people burning orchards and things like that?
Yeah, well, it's part of the history of the transition of the Central Valley. Frankly, in the 70s and probably early 80s, most of the agriculture in the Central Valley was really crops that in some sense could be turned over. So in other words, there weren't a lot of almond trees and pistachio trees. There were more things like tomatoes and cotton, alfalfa, et cetera, where, in any given year, you didn't have to pile it up and burn it. You just wouldn't either grow, or you could somehow put this back into the soil and remove it very easily. The Central Valley's transition to the world's supplier of almonds. 80% of the world's almonds are produced in 2 or 3 counties in the world, and they're right in the midst of the Central Valley. And the question became, with such large amounts of things like almond trees, pistachio trees, grapes, vines, this huge explosion in the Central Valley created a very large problem of, when these reach their useful life, what happens to the waste? And so the alternative, and at least the method at that time, was to burn in the fields. So you'd have open burning of the new crop, if you will, in the Central Valley, which are, some of the larger trees that are very hard to dispose of.
As you mentioned, those bills were passed in 2003, so that's been 20 plus years till we've seen it become enacted. That seems unusual. Why such a delay?
Yeah, well, I found in my time in government, I've been around government for the last 30 years, true lasting change does take a lot of time. And most of it was because we gave some pretty strict requirements on when, and in a phased manner, when some of this stuff was going to begin. In the original bill, we had, from the time it was introduced in 2003, we really wanted the large producers of most of the waste to end the practice by 2007. And then the very hard things to do, like grapes, where you have vines that have wire in them and pesticides, you didn't want that burned, but it took time to unwind that industry. So we gave them an additional 3 years. So the bill really required that this practice be ended in 2010. But in the negotiations, like anything in the legislature, we had a really tough time getting it through the state assembly. And most of the folks there wanted a requirement to include just 3 words, that it had to be economically feasible, 2 words actually. And we agreed to that because we really wanted to work with the agriculture community, wanted to make sure this was not putting folks out of business, if you will. And so the time frame, combined with the fact that, if indeed things were not economically feasible, that there could be an allowance of continued burning, seemed like a good place to start. And I had assumed back in 2003, by 2010, we would have wrapped this up. But we gave the power also to the local air district, and the local air district continued to say, our farmers say this is economically infeasible. So the practice just really continued with very little progress.
Do you think the delays had any effects on public health or anything else?
Absolutely. I mean, anytime we're delaying something so simple as watching an entire field on fire and watching the health effects of that, it is definitely, a practice that took a long time. It costs a lot of people, I assume, a lot of health issues. But at some point it needed to end. I mean, it's hard to end the practice. It's been around since 1850, but just having any ending point to that is going to be a positive for public health. And I think this was a good meeting point with agriculture in terms of finding out when, this practice could actually be ended.
You're no longer a legislator, but until just a few weeks ago, you were serving on the California Air Resources Board. Can you give us a sense of what other sort of air quality issues you would want to see addressed in the Valley or in the state?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally we still are lacking transparency on what our air really is at any given point in time. And by is means, we need a lot more indoor air monitoring in our schools. I think we can have red flag days. We can have bad air days. We all watch it on the news. We all see the flags go up in our schools. But yet with technology, I think there's still a way to find a better way to do monitoring real time so that we have a better idea of how bad the air is. And more importantly, ways to improve it, either through air filtration or other items, because I think people feel, the bad air stops when you go inside your home. Well, it does if you have good filtration systems, but at the same time, everyone should have a better awareness of kind of what the air is, and the outdoor monitoring programs that are going on by our local air districts are super important as well. I think it's important for people to know what the air quality it really is as much as they know the weather, because I think it's something that you can adjust for, understand. Maybe there's some things that you can't do outdoors that you'd be aware of. And more importantly, if you can't measure it, you probably can't fix it. So if you can measure the air quality, there are going to be a lot more things, I think, on the horizon that will allow us to get kind of cleaner air.
That was my conversation with Dean Flores. He's the original author of a bill that banned agricultural burning in California. That law finally went into effect fully earlier this month. And that's today's show. Today's episode was produced by Jonathan Linden and KVPR with support from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Find the latest local news anytime at kvpr.org.
We could all use a little help navigating the news these days. The Consider This podcast wants to give you a hand. 6 days a week, we'll help you make sense of the day's biggest news story and what it means for you in less than 15 minutes. Listen now to the Consider This podcast from NPR.